So I started looking through the news headlines last weekend, and for the first time in what I can think of, the headlines weren't all about the pandemic. And I got really excited. I thought, finally, maybe we can get to the point where COVID-19 isn't running absolutely every aspect of my life. But then reality began to sink in. And once I got past the idea that somehow NHL players were essential workers in our economy, I got to the point where the headlines were dark. And I realized that it wasn't that the pandemic was just magically over overnight, but that other more desperate headlines were taking priority in the news. So now, on top of hundreds of thousands of people dying from the pandemic and the economy imploding due to necessary restrictions and distancing, now cities all over the US are exploding as people either respond to injustice and systemic racism, or others use the national grief and anger as a cover to loot and to destroy. It didn't get better. Somehow, it managed to get worse. Sometimes, when the news feed is just full of endless bad news, we just want things to end. We want things to be done. Maybe if Jesus would just return, we could escape this world. And this, I think, is not an uncommon wish. We start to grasp at straws, but we also read about a similar situation in Jeremiah, about how Israel during their exile just wanted it to end. They wanted to go home. They wanted things to return to normal. And there were prophets in exile with the Israelites who were encouraging just exactly that line of thinking. They were saying, don't worry, it's going to be a very short period of time before Yahweh comes and smites our enemies, and Israel will once again rise, ascendant over all of the nations as God's chosen people. So your job in exile is just to keep your head down and mutter under your breath at the dirty pagans if you have to, because very soon God will get us out of here and will exact revenge on our enemies for us. And that sounds like today. Always we want a shortcut to end discomfort or danger. We want a magic pill or a potion that will cure everything from hair loss to whatever it is that's ailing us. We want the idea to be able to donate some money to this or that cause and we'll get whatever we wish for. We want a returning Jesus to save us from a corrupt and evil world. But this isn't what God had in mind for Israel then in exile. And I don't think it's what God has in mind for us now. See, in Jeremiah 29, we're told that a prophet went to Israel and told them, rather than trying to escape exile, thrive in it. Build a meaningful life in the harshest of circumstances. And the advice to us today would be to do the same thing. As my one friend likes to put it, don't waste a good pandemic. We're merely surviving the present rather than thriving in it. So often, then we come to a passage like 1 Thessalonians 4, and we want to read about the great escape. We long for paradise, for getting out of the hurt and the evil of our existence, and we just want Jesus to get us out of here and up to there. I think, though, that this isn't what Paul had in mind when he was writing this letter to the Thessalonians. I think that rather than writing about the end of all things, Paul was writing a pastoral encouragement to his church and to his people about living life in the middle of all things. Did you know that the reach of our church has actually grown in the middle of this? God is absolutely amazing. People are able to participate meaningfully in church services that haven't been able to come for years. New people are tuning in. God has been at work amongst us in the middle of our isolation and exile. In the middle of the pandemic, we're becoming the outward-looking, priestly people of God that we've been intended to be from the beginning. Do we want the pandemic to be over? Yes, absolutely we do. But we also want to acknowledge that there are good changes that God has been bringing about in his church as a result of all of this. And we need to take those changes and hold on to them until they become a deeply ingrained, natural part of who we are. So I think that the key to this passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 that we're looking at today is not found in rapture. Rather, instead, I think it's found in the phrase at the end of it that Paul uses, where he says, encourage one another with these words. Now, I'm sure that there are those who would say that getting away from this world and the great escape from evil would be great encouragement indeed, especially if it happened right before the Great Tribulation or the punishment of everybody left behind. After all, who wants to suffer? I know that I certainly don't, but then tell me, if we're to escape as Christians, how is this good news to my uncle, who was a biker and an ex-convict trying to find his way through life? How is this good news and encouragement to my friend who, as of right now, can't seem to find his way towards belief in God? How can I be encouraged by the idea that at the moment of my friends and loved ones' greatest need and greatest hurt, God removes all people of faith, the only people who have the truth of Jesus to share with folks who are in pain and in need? How can I be encouraged by the idea that I leave while they suffer? Friends, this isn't encouragement. If it is, it's hollow and empty. It's not just that. It ignores the idea that Jesus experienced the forsaking of God on the cross so that we didn't have to. That my friends, that loved ones, and billions like them would be abandoned by God in their hour of need and suffering is not encouraging. J. Richard Morrison, a seminary professor, says that the key to understanding this encouragement is to understand what Paul meant by the idea of being caught up and meeting with. He says that the scripture that this has most to do with is not a passage and a futuristic reading of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, but rather the triumphal entry in the Gospels. The point that Paul is trying to make is not one of being taken away, but one of accompanying back. So a couple of weeks ago, my son Alex went out for his first parent-free bike ride with a buddy. So they're out on the trails of West Lethbridge, they're exploring, and they're fearless, and they're going their own way until they hit a patch of gravel. And Alex's friend really biffed it hard. He put a hole in his knee, and the blood was flowing. And now Alex is faced with a choice. He had a few options of how he could respond. So the first thing that he could do is he could simply sit down in the dust and stay with his friend and offer what encouragement he could, except he didn't have the skills or the ability to be able to actually help heal the wound. Or he could be glad that it wasn't him that fell off of his bike, and he could get out of there as fast as he could because the sight of blood is gross, and his friend was hurting, and there wasn't anything that he could do about it anyway. So he could leave and go back home and be glad it didn't happen to him. The third option is that he could go and find help. So what Alex actually did is he went to a nearby house and he found an adult, and he brought her back to clean and bandage his friend's knee. And together they were then able to make it back home. And friends, I think that this is what is happening in Thessalonians 4. See, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey in what we call the triumphal entry, people rushed out to meet him on the road and to honor him. And then not to stay out of Jerusalem, but to walk back into the city with him. Jesus, the only one who can rescue us from sin and injury and death, and the only one who can heal our disease, is on the way. And he brings with him all those who eagerly await his power to help, because they know that something is wrong, and they know that Jesus is the solution. So for the believers in the Thessalonian church, they were concerned that those who had already died before the return of Jesus were going to be missing at his return. See, they hadn't yet understood the meaning of Jesus' resurrection, and therefore they misunderstood death. They believed that those who died before Jesus returned would be stuck in death and would miss out on the triumphal return of the King and his kingdom. They didn't understand that there is hope in the resurrection. For them, they were still caught in the pagan belief that death is the end and has the final word. Paul says that they don't need to worry about that, because when Jesus comes back to his creation, his way will be lined first with those who have died, rushing out to meet their Lord on his triumphal entry and the fullness of his kingdom. Then those who are still living will also go out to meet their King and proceed in triumph back to their homes, bringing with them the glory of Jesus, spurned and crucified by humanity, but now vindicated and victorious, surrounded by those who need him, going back into a creation that can't heal itself or save itself or escape the slavery of sin and death on its own. They don't escape at the moment of tribulation. Rather, they go and they find the only one who can help them be ultimately victorious over evil and death. This, my friends, is deep, lasting encouragement. In the day where it looks like evil wins, the end of the book has already been written. We will be vindicated with the powerful Creator, the Messiah that we worship. We will be reunited with loved ones and fellow family members. And by this, I mean the church.